we're back in the car on a Thursday, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of this Thursday late afternoon into early evening drive home here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, we have another entry in our continuing series of guilty pleasure movies, and it's somewhat shocking to myself that I have not already talked about this movie, but here we go. We're going back to the mid-1990s and a summer 1994 release, which felt a little bit like counter-programming in a summer with Forrest Gump, True Lies, The Lion King, Beverly Hills Cop 3. What else do we have that summer? The Mask with Jim Carrey. But in the middle of June 1994, we got the third collaboration between director Mike Nichols, who also did The Graduate, right, with Dustin Hoffman, but the third collaboration between Mike Nichols and fellow legend John Joseph Nicholson, known as Jack. The movie is the romantic horror thriller corporate politics drama Wolf. And all of that word salad is pretty much this movie. There is a lot of stuff going on in this film. It's like got enough plot for 5 or 6 movies, but to me it has just the right amount for this one. You have an amazing cast of not only Jack Nicholson, but playing his wife, you have Kate Nelligan, terrific actress, and you have the late great Christopher Plummer as Jack's boss, Michelle Pfeiffer as as Christopher Plummer's character's daughter, and you have great actors on the periphery of the story, such as Richard Jenkins, who's always a tremendous supporting performer. He worked with both Jack and Michelle in The Witches of Eastwick, and it's just a fun movie. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot James Spader, who almost feels like a secondary lead for stretches of this film. This movie was not entirely successful either with critics or audiences or financially. It was produced and marketed for somewhere around 70 million, and it grossed a little over 130 worldwide. And I mean, that's okay, but it was not a hit. And it actually did almost as well overseas as it did in the United States. You would have thought maybe this was starring Sylvester Stallone. And let me tell you something. You take this exact story and cast, and you put Stallone in there, man, it would have been fucking gold. You imagine Stallone as a werewolf? I gave it away. Hey, dirtbag, you're a lousy shot. I don't like lousy shots. You wasted a kid. You're a talking werewolf. Now I think I'm going to waste you. But this movie gives Jack Nicholson, who was in his late 50s at the time, well, mid to late 50s, it gives him a chance to play big again. And his performance style, I don't want to say similar to Al Pacino, but there are a lot of movies where you can see Nicholson just letting his hair down, so to speak, and just having a good time, and that the director gives him free rein. I felt like Scorsese gave him too much rope in The Departed. I feel like, as absurd as it is to even say it this way, I feel like Jack is the weak link in that film. I just don't think his performance, like maybe he was the wrong actor, it doesn't work for me at all. You look at how Johnny Depp, the handle he had on what amounts to the same character of Whitey Bulger, Depp is chilling. Nicholson plays the guy like a deadly clown, almost a Tommy DeVito type of character. It just doesn't work. But in the movie Wolf, there is a lot of notions of corporate politics, of backstabbing friends, and there is the idea of a man getting to a certain age and he kind of loses his potency, and put that in quotes, and you can take from that what you will. Losing his masculinity, losing his virility, all that stuff, which really does happen. But this film is about that. And this film seems to be arguing that if you're in a position like Jack Nicholson, a guy who has been pretty successful in life, has a wife who is still pretty freaking hot, given his age and her age, and he's got a good job, but he seems like not that he's outlived his usefulness, but he may have outlived his usefulness in the corporate world, because he may just be too kind and decent of a guy. Maybe what he needs is a few swift kicks in the neck a la Chuck Norris, but in the world of this film, it turns out all he needs is an encounter with some kind of a wolf-like creature who appears to bite him in the manner of the guy at the beginning of American Werewolf in London, attacks David Naughton's buddy, and then attacks him, and here we go. We got ourselves an American Werewolf in London. Great title, right on the nose. But in this movie, Jack's best friend is played by James Spader, and James Spader's character of Stuart Swinton is a backstabbing piece of shit. He's a really lousy guy who puts it over on Jack in a lot of different ways, and we get this very early in the film. I'm not really spoiling anything. But Jack is a guy who he is experiencing things to do with aging that normal people will experience. And he doesn't complain about it, but his eyesight is starting to go. And, maybe in the immortal words of Walter Matthau, maybe it's more of a hold-up than a stick-up. Maybe the sex life isn't that great, despite the fact that Kate Nelligan is still hot. She's not doing that great. But then, after the encounter with the wolf, all of a sudden, each of his senses are heightened immediately. Like he doesn't turn into a werewolf in the first, but his senses become heightened. He suddenly has incredible hearing. He has a lot of strength. He suddenly, the stories they used to tell about Jack Nicholson at the Playboy Mansion, where I don't even know how many women he'd be hooking up with in a single night, but he'd be going for hours. You can Google that. He said he used to just wolf down peanut butter sandwiches, and he would just keep them going. But all of a sudden, he is blue steel, and Kate Nelligan seems pretty happy about that. Problem is, his boss, played by Christopher Plummer, thinks that he's basically a punk, and he's a little bit of a bitch, and he fires him. Or at least he tries to fire him. But it turns out he's picked the wrong time and the wrong day to fuck with this guy. And Jack turns the tables on his boss in such a clever and artful way that even Christopher Plummer's character of Papa Alden, that's the name, he's Alden, and Laura Alden is the name of Michelle Pfeiffer's character, but he does it so artfully that Christopher Plummer actually says, Will, I'd have never fired you if I knew you were this ruthless. Like, he wanted him to be a piece of shit. He wanted him to be like his buddy, Stuart Swinton. And James Spader brought a certain level of baggage. This is not the James Spader of the Blacklist in later era, or even, Robert California in The Office. This is still the James Spader who is playing the hard-charging yuppie. Now, he didn't play only heels. He did an interesting film, not entirely successful, with John Cusack in the early 90s called True Colors. The reason why that film is interesting is the expectation would have been, if you have two characters who purport to be idealistic and get involved in politics, the guy that's going to turn out to be the scumbag is going to be the James Spader character, but that movie inverts it, and it succeeds in that regard. But Spader played a lot of yuppie guys that, I really don't want to meet this person. I'd really rather not meet this guy in this particular existence. So Jack Nicholson as Will, he knows that there's been some malfeasance here, and that Stuart is the reason why he was temporarily out of a job. So they have a moment in the men's room, and I saw this movie on its opening night with my dad. The previews were really good. The reviews are okay. The movie is barely fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. I think a lot of critics of the day, they expected more, given the talent of the cast, and given, the screenwriter Wesley Strick, a tremendously talented writer, and Mike Nichols. It's sitting at 62% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's barely fresh. But my dad and I, the previews look good. New York Magazine's David Denby gave it kind of a lukewarm. He didn't do thumbs up, and he didn't. You had to actually read the review to see if he liked the movie. Not that many critics did that. But Denby was pretty clever. He never did a star rating or a thumbs up or thumbs down a la Siskel and Ebert. You actually had to read the review, and reading Denby's risk, and I think he's kind of giving it a thumbs up. Yeah, let's go see it. So there's a scene in this film after the cards are on the table, and Jack Nicholson knows that his buddy was not really his buddy. And he's mad at him, but he's not gonna wolf out. He's not gonna kill him or do anything like that. But they're into John, presumably to take a leak. And James Spader goes up to him, trying to apologize. And Jack Nicholson just turns around and, not in a sexual way, he starts peeing on him. And Spader's reaction, it's almost like they didn't tell him what was in the scene, because he has such a natural reaction to this. He goes, "What are you, nuts? What are you doing?" And Jack, in one of his best moments of the 90s, obviously aside from "You can't handle the truth, you want me on that wall, you need me on that wall," Jack shoots it all over the place. That's what she said, but he shoots it all over the place. And as James Spader is just stunned, Jack goes, "I'm just marking my territory." He's just marking his territory, because that's what animals do. That is what alpha animals do. And so, yeah, Jack with the makeup, and they put some wolf stuff on him, and you're not really sure. There are various points in the film where he appears to be able to have super strength and still have human intelligence. The film kind of plays around with that in a way I'm not entirely sure it works. But the Kate Nelligan character, I feel like the film does not play fair with her character, because at points she seems very sympathetic and supportive of Jack, and then she's just really a lousy person. So I feel like they could have done better with that character, and they maybe could have done better with the James Spader character. But the way that Jack engages Michelle Pfeiffer, it's another moment where it's difficult to imagine any other actor pulling this off. Jack Nicholson, unlike, for example, Robert Redford or even Dustin Hoffman, because Dustin Hoffman has the look of an underdog. But Jack Nicholson didn't necessarily play that many entirely likable protagonists. In fact, I'm racking my brain and I'm not coming up with that many. Every protagonist he played is either somewhat of a heel, a full-on heel where he's, an anti-hero. In this movie, it's closer to a conventional, decent person. But he has a moment when he meets Michelle Pfeiffer's character of Laura Alden. I think they knew of each other, but they had never really interacted. This is the daughter of his either former boss or boss, depending on what point in the movie it is, where Jack starts to kind of throw his weight around and starts threatening everybody else. And I don't mean physically in this sense. I mean like, you fired me. Here's the severance package I want. I've got dirt on you, and if you don't play ball, I'm going to fuck you over in court, pal. More or less what he says to him. So Michelle Pfeiffer, I've always felt, is a little bit undersold as to just how good of an actress she is. She is somebody who can be funny, and she is somebody who has played very heavy drama and done it exceedingly well. Multiple Oscar nominee, and unfortunately, her Best Actress nomination for Love Field, it felt like a courtesy nomination. That movie's not that good, and I feel like her character doesn't really make any sense in that film. But Michelle Pfeiffer, from a certain point of view, was held back by just how beautiful she is in real life, and just how stunning she looks on screen and has looked on screen. And so when Jack meets her, it's like the elephant in the room, and it's been the elephant in the room in a lot of her roles and in her career. It's difficult to get past it. The Fabulous Baker Boys plays to that as a strength, and it does it deliberately. But in the world of this film, Jack engages her, and they start to talk, and he doesn't appreciate the way that she is talking to him. She is seeming to condescend to him, and this is something that probably would have been okay with him earlier in the movie before he got bitten by a wolf. But now he's not having it. You're going to talk to me like this. I'm in your home. I expect a little bit of courtesy. You know, expect a little bit of courtesy. How about that? So she's still giving him attitude, and he drops the hammer on her and does it brilliantly. And it's as memorable a moment, you know, in a film that a lot of people, I would say under 35, haven't seen. This is another moment of Jack Nicholson showing why he was Jack Nicholson and how he's able to do this and not lose the plot and not lose the audience. So I'm paraphrasing, but I'm going to come real close. It's a key moment in the film because it shows that he's more perceptive now. He's been bitten by a wolf. Everything is functioning at a much higher frequency. Every part of his physiology and every part of him neurologically. He's making more perceptive points. He's like a genius now. It's almost like John Travolta a couple of years later in Phenomenon. You take an ordinary schmuck and turn him into Superman up here between the ears. So the elephant in the room, Jack actually broaches the topic. He says, you know, Miss Alden, you're beautiful. You think men are only interested in you because you're beautiful. You want them to look past all that. You want them to not only be interested in you because you're beautiful, you want them to take the time to try to get to know the real you. The problem there, underneath all that beauty, you're just not very interesting. But you understand, and you still want people, and men in particular, to look past all that. But the only reason why they would even attempt to look past all that is because you're beautiful. It's ironic, isn't it? In a way, you're your own problem. And I remember Jack delivering that soliloquy in theaters, and the audience started laughing as he got into it, and by the time he wrapped up, it was, you would have thought that it was like Jim Carrey in Ace Ventura. The audience was practically yelling and screaming with laughter. It was so well done. And Michelle Pfeiffer's reaction also perfect. She does not have an outsized reaction. She is offended, but she's also intrigued that anybody would ever talk to her like this. She's not used to it. So the story, it has the romance elements, and yes, Jack and Michelle, once again, not really much of a spoiler. It's all over the posters. They get it on, they get together, and it doesn't take the form of a conventional romance, you know, and this is something that my favorite film critic Roger Ebert would point out. If the main romance in the movie doesn't start until the film is more than half over, it's not a real romance. That wasn't how he described it, something like that. But the film has a certain weird energy that works. And because the ground rules of the lycanthropy and the werewolf stuff, they're not really firmly established. We don't know how this film is going to go. Is Jack going to die? Is Michelle going to die? Is James Spader going to die? Is anybody other than Jack going to become a werewolf? Because, again, to go back to American Werewolf in London, we only meet two werewolves in that film. We meet a guy at the beginning, and then the character of David Kessler, played by David Norton. That's it. There's no one else. There's other characters that get torn apart, but nobody else becomes a werewolf. So is this going to be an American Werewolf in London kind of a run out where Jack is the only person, or are they going to do something else? And is there a concept in this film that if you're a decent person before you become a werewolf, you're not going to be a murderous piece of shit when you do become a werewolf? But if you're a terrible person, you will be a terrible person. And this is something The Mask, which was released like a week after this movie, The Mask actually gets into the same concept. Because when Jim Carrey puts on the mask, he's still a decent guy. He's not hurting normal people. When Dorian puts the mask on, he is basically a serial killer with superpowers. So the movie Wolf, is it going to be that? Or is it going to be something that we're not expecting? And as I say, the movie did decently at the box office, not as well as it could have, but I do think a lot of people went in with the wrong expectation. It seems to not be able to decide, is this going to be a big, brassy romance? Is this a werewolf movie? Or ultimately, is this a movie about corporate politics and you need a little bit, if you're getting up there in years, you need a little shot of adrenaline, or dare I say, a little TRT, right? Maybe that's what Jack needed. Maybe this movie is a plea for TRT decades before that was just normally done above board, and not, doctors giving you a little testosterone when things started to slow down a little bit, and it was a little bit more of a hold-up than a stick-up. This is a film that I really appreciate, though. I like that this kind of a big cast did what amounted to a sort of trashy movie. Because this is a guilty pleasure movie. It was not supposed to be Oscar bait or anything like that. But the actors take the material seriously. And even though I did say, and I agree and believe that the Kate Nelligan character is given short shrift, she's a very, very fine actress. And, again, I forgot, speaking of Michelle Pfeiffer, they did Frankie and Johnny together. She was one of the waitresses. So there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination with actors and actresses who worked with each other in different films. Frankie and Johnny being, of course, with Al Pacino. But this movie is super entertaining. I don't know anybody who has seen it and said, man, that movie sucks. Most people would put it in the sort of guilty pleasure category, and that it was a departure for Jack in certain areas. Once he sort of wolfs out, he has a little bit of, the Jack Napier Joker in him, a little bit of the Daryl Van Horn from Witches of Eastwick 7 years prior with Michelle Pfeiffer. But the character that he plays is one of the quote-unquote nicest protagonists. And again, I'm racking my brain. The character of Warren Schmidt, I would say, might be the nicest guy that Jack ever played, where he starts the film as somebody who's worked his tail off his whole life and has got money, but he's not happy. And he's kind of coming to the end of the line, or he thinks he is, and he wants to do something else. Doesn't want to be content to drive around in a mobile home with a wife that he barely spends any time with and has barely even gotten to know in the last 30 years. That's a little bit more of a conventional, that's probably the most likable protagonist, where there's very little of Jack in that character. This guy, Will, in Wolf, starts off closer to a Warren Schmidt, and we're expecting more because it's Jack. We don't get more until the accident and the incident with the wolf. I feel like that's really all I wanted to say about this movie. I know that it was streaming on Paramount for a time. I don't know that it's ever been on Netflix or free with Prime, but this is the sort of movie that could be streaming on Tubi. Tubi gets a lot of the horror films. I wouldn't call this a horror movie. It has a couple of scenes that are lit as if you're in a horror movie. And yes, there is werewolf effects work, and there's some pretty cool shots that I think are like process shots. There's no CGI in this film. The effects are practical. There's some mechanical effects, which are pretty cool. Mike Nichols was not really a big special effects kind of a filmmaker. But this is a fun ride all the way, even if, like me, you'll have a lot of problems or some problems with the plot mechanics and the way certain characters are presented. But it is fun to see Jack, to some extent, go ham in the second half of the film. Anger Management, another movie that's a real guilty pleasure, where he just goes completely bonkers, but it kind of works for that story. And his character's turn works in this story. And once again, Jack could have phoned it in, and he did not. He could have given this kind of performance with his eyes closed in his sleep, walking backwards, but he didn't. He gives it what he's got, and he doesn't take a movie off because he knows that this is kind of a silly script. He comes to play, and you can feel the delineation of the character. Even though Jack's line readings are not that much different, he doesn't do that much as far as vocal inflections, but it's the forcefulness and the way that he gets the slightest smirk after he delivers lines with the same affectation that we know, okay, this guy means business. It's time for people to stop fucking with him. And yeah, you know what? There's a lot to be said for that when you reach a point in your life where you're just tired of people walking all over you. And you know what? I'm going to do something else now. I'm going to stand up for myself to a greater extent, and let's just see what happens. So, the newest entry in our continuing series of guilty pleasure movies, 1994's Wolf, directed by Mike Nichols from a screenplay by, I think it was two guys, Jim Harrison, I think, and Wesley Strick, who I mentioned, and starring Jack Nicholson, Kate Nelligan, Christopher Plummer, James Spader, and a really strong turn from Michelle Pfeiffer. I'll spare the exaggerated wrap-up, and I'll just wish you all a great rest of your Thursday night. Peace out.